Well, welcome and thank you for coming to the agriculture risk modeling session. My name is Guillermo Pacheco. I work at the World Bank in risk financing in the agriculture. I think this is going to be a very interesting session, not only because risk modeling is a key factor for development in the agriculture sector, but also because we have a very interesting panel of experts with good knowledge and extensive expertise in this area. As many as you know, agriculture is very vulnerable to extreme weather events. In a climate change context, floods and droughts are predicted to increase in frequency and intensity in the next year. So, and agriculture remains a major activity in nearly 75% for 75% of people living in rural areas in developing countries. So, and unfortunately, financial products and services are rare to reach for farmers. Agricultural lending is constrained in many parts of the world due to the correlation of severe weather events affecting a large number of people at the same time, and it's also a problem that the lack of insurance companies don't want to protect them against this risk. However, in the past decade, some progress has been made to increase and facilitate farmers the access to agriculture insurance. Index-based weather insurance makes payments based on independent measures such as rainfall that are correlated with the incurred losses. This form of insurance is appropriate in developing countries because the use of an index avoids many of the challenges that the traditional insurance face, and also reduce the costs associated with loss assessments. Nonetheless, we are learning that the application of index-based weather insurance have limitations, and such as the availability of weather data. But I will not spend precious time talking about this innovative type of insurance, and I will let our experts present and explain how weather risk modeling facilitates the implementation of this type of insurance in difficult geographical areas in the developing world. So we have 3 presentations, and the first presentation is modeling in agricultural risk in microclimates, and it's going to be more specific in the case of the Blue Mountain coffee region in Jamaica. And the first presenter is Simon Jung, and I will let Simon to present himself just a little bit.
Thanks, Guillermo. I'm a background in earth sciences and have been doing catastrophe risk modeling and application of catastrophe risk modeling in the Caribbean for more than 15 years now, and elsewhere, but mainly in the Caribbean. And my company, Caribbean Risk Managers, is the supervisor of the Caribbean Cat Risk Insurance Facility, which is a government a sovereign risk cat risk transfer facility that was set up with the help of the World Bank in the Caribbean just over 3 years ago.
The next presentation is going to be made by Alex Losh and William Dick. This presentation is about the modeling flood risk for the agricultural production, and I will let them to present themselves.
All right, I didn't expect to have to introduce myself, but I guess that's the format. I'm Alex Lodge. I used to work in the field of risk management, risk financing, currently work on carbon finance, so more on mitigation of climate change. And I'm also a geoscientist with background in remote sensing and geoinformation science.
Good morning. My name is William Dick. I work in the Agriculture and Rural Development Department of the World Bank as a consultant, specifically in the Agricultural Risk Management team. My background is as an agriculturalist, and I've worked in agricultural insurance and reinsurance business throughout the world for quite a large number of years. Yeah.
Our last presentation is going to be made by Edgar Uribe, with a brief introduction from Pablo Valdivia. Edgar, if you can say some words about yourself.
I'm a hydroclimatologist. I'm from Mexico, and I've been working lately in insurance products. I started in a company in Mexico called Agroacemex, and after that I started working with the World Bank.
Thank you. And Pablo Valdivia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pablo. I'm an agronomist, and I'm also a rice paddy farmer. I'm based in Nicaragua, and I help the World Bank in trying to develop agricultural insurance in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Pablo. So, as I said, our first presentation will be modeling of agricultural risk in microclimates, with the case of the Blue Mountain Coffee region in Jamaica. Simon, if you...
Thanks, Guillermo. So I'm going to highlight some of the work that we've been doing with the World Bank team on the Blue Mountain Coffee region in Jamaica, and I think it's a nice little example of some of the challenges that Guillermo hinted at in designing index insurance solutions in complex and quite small areas, and I'm not sure that we've got through all of those challenges yet, but I think my purpose here is to highlight some of the, certainly from the hazard modeling point of view, some of the challenges we're facing and some of the solutions we're trying. Blue Mountain Coffee, as I think most of you know, is one of the world's premier brands of coffee, but the industry is highly susceptible to hydrometeorological hazards. The growing season is largely synchronous with the Atlantic hurricane season, which started earlier this week. The combination of wind and rain is particularly devastating. I mean, either one on their own are bad, but the two of them working together is greater than the sum of the parts of them. And the mountainous terrain that the Blue Mountain Coffee is grown in adds to the problems, both in terms of the level of hazards. Both rain and wind in hurricanes increases with altitude, but also in terms of trying to come up with indexing of hazards at a very at a scale that's good enough to actually represent changes on the ground, which are very quick and occur over very short distances. So this is as some context. This is the basically the eastern half of Jamaica. I've cut off the far eastern part, but you can see, and the red area is what we defined as the Blue Mountain Coffee region, and the black dots are the collection points for coffee. And for scale, there's a scale at the top right, but also the circles around each of the dots is 1 kilometer, and the red grid is 1 kilometer. So we're talking about an area 20 kilometers by 10 kilometers, or 25 kilometers by 10 kilometers. The altitude there, it ranges from a couple of hundred meters in the low areas up to 2.5, just over 2,000 meters at the top of the Blue Mountains. The coffee doesn't span that entire range, but there is quite a range of altitudes that we're working with as well. So we're talking about a very condensed area with a highly variable topography. So some background: traditional indemnity insurance schemes have failed due to a variety of factors. Most recently, Hurricane Ivan in 2004 basically ended interest by the global reinsurance markets in providing traditional cover for the coffee crop and for the farmers. Even though there have been some kind of interim things being put in place, there ultimately needs to be a long-term solution to help these farmers and help the Jamaican government to protect this very important industry. So index-based insurance, we feel, provides a potential solution. However, the small size of farms and cultivated area, the variability in hazard levels, which I've highlighted, and both of them together provide really big challenges to try and reduce the basis risk so that it gets down to an acceptable level. This is a wind footprint map for Hurricane Ivan. Hurricane Ivan actually stayed offshore of Jamaica. It was tracking pretty much across the island until about 24 hours before it was due to make landfall very near to Kingston on the south coast. And then it did a 90-degree left turn, thanks to a lot of praying in the Jamaican community. So it did stay offshore, and so the winds weren't actually particularly strong. The winds range from Cat 2, which is the green area in the middle there, or I don't know what, they're all green, but so I apologize for that, but the kind of more yellowy green area in the middle, which actually corresponds exactly to, if I just go back a couple of slides, to the peak altitude area. So there's a very good correlation between this wind and altitude, but you can see there's a variability there in some of the valleys, and this modeling is being done at a 1 kilometer resolution. So some of the valleys are getting, sub 50 mile an hour winds, whereas some of the peaks are getting over 100 mile an hour winds. So there's a lot of variability between here, and again, the variability of actually where coffee is grown won't be quite that big, but there is quite a significant variability across this small area from the same storm. This is and I apologize for the color schemes. The color schemes were taking into account a whole bunch of different storms, and I just pulled out Ivan to show today, but this is the rainfall map for Ivan, and it was much more of a rain event. But if it had just been a pure rain event, the damage to the coffee industry would not have been as high because the wind actually exacerbated the impact from the rain. So even the relatively low wind speeds had a major impact, largely because so much rain fell. And so the red areas here are above 12 inches of rain, and quite a few of those areas above 20 inches of rain. This is a 4-day, this is a storm total, but that was about 3 or 4 days of rain. But again, you've got down to 3 inches in some areas, and some areas right adjacent to each other are getting highly variable amounts of rain. So it shows the variability of the impacts from single events. So some of the other challenges to designing an index-based product. We have a general lack of historical wind and rain data in the coffee-growing areas from ground measurements. Rain is a little better, and I'll come on to talk a little bit about that. Wind, there is basically no on-the-ground wind measurement in the Blue Mountains for any wind speed, let alone high or peak wind speed. So our on-the-ground knowledge of peak winds is very poor, and rain is better, but it's still not particularly good. And particularly for rain data, often the rain gauges are manually emptied rain gauges daily. And during storms, there are two factors that are at play. If in high winds, then a traditional rain gauge catches certainly less than all the rainfall that's falling, and sometimes significantly less. And the estimated error in high winds is about 75% for a normal rain gauge. So there's that issue. But the secondary issue is if the rain gauge isn't emptied every day, then you don't get a daily. You might get a storm total, but then it's quite likely that the gauge itself will actually be full. And so quite often you'll find that there's missing data in exactly the time you want it because the person who is emptying the rain gauge hasn't been able to get to the rain gauge. So these factors, they might seem somewhat insignificant, but actually if you look at the rainfall record, the real data that you want, the extreme events, is missing or certainly more has a bigger error bar around it than the rest of the data. We also have a lack of really good quantitative impacts from past events on individual coffee plants, and this is something that William and Pablo and the World Bank team are working very hard with the Coffee Industry Board, of which Christopher Gentles, who's just arrived next to me, is the president, director, Director General. We're working very closely with the Coffee Industry Board to try and use the farmers' own knowledge of the impacts from the historical events that they remember to try and build some vulnerability functions, because quite simply there isn't any quantitative data that's really being collected at the time of the events. We have gross data on general levels of delivery, etc., after storms, but very little data on that we can really pin to use to develop these vulnerability functions. And there's a lack of really high quality quantitative and localized quantitative information on the industry as a whole. I think that there's good aggregate data, but drilling down to individual areas which are being affected differently in individual events is challenging as well. And certainly the level of information that we would want going into designing an index insurance program it takes a lot of work to get there. I've said most of this. The first point I've said already. The second point on the rain data, unfortunately in Jamaica, the pre-1992 rainfall records held by the Meteorological Service were destroyed in a fire. There are statistical summaries of those records going back generally 40 to 60 years. So there are statistical summaries of a number of rain gauges in the Blue Mountains, mainly in the lower areas, not in the peak areas. But so we have a statistical summary of about 40 years of data for about 10 stations. And then since 1992, we have continuous records, except for the peak events, which I've highlighted already, or semi-continuous records for 18 years for the best stations and 15 for the not-so-good ones. And we have about 20 of those, I would say, of which 10 we have records going further, statistical records going further back. The satellite approaches, which one might think about using in other areas, are not suitable here, and I'll show you why in a minute. What our overall picture is that we don't really have any option but to go for a modelled rainfall at the start. We don't feel that the current instrumentation is good enough to base an index product solely on. But we hope to be able to move to that as we establish new stations, establish a baseline of those stations, calibrate the older stations and maybe upgrade those, and then gradually move to either a combination of modelled and ground-based information or just ground-based information. But we feel like that's going to be a process that's going to go on over a 5 to 10 year period before we can get fully away from it, be in a position to get fully away from a modelled approach. Obviously, this isn't ideal. Modelling has implications for not only for basis risk, but also for I guess selling the policies to the farmers to demonstrate to them that this is, the rainfall that's coming out of a model or the wind is really a reasonable estimate. And I think everybody knows and is much more comfortable with being able to look at a rain gauge and see the rain falling in it and see a measurement. So even if one from a scientific perspective could say, well, actually it's much better to do a modelled rainfall than an actual rainfall, that doesn't really fly, or certainly not in the long term, we feel, for a sustainable program. This is the distribution of rain gauges. As I said, they're mostly around the periphery. This is mainly because the high areas of the Blue Mountains aren't populated at all, and so there has never been really any need to collect data there. So the pink stations are active stations, and the green ones are active as well, and then the white ones are inactive, but some of them we have a historical data for. So we have a reasonable, I guess, coverage, but some of the peaks are missing, particularly in the central area. This is a footprint of the TRMM, the Tropical Rainfall Measurement Mission, which is a joint NASA, Japan Space Agency mission, and the footprint of the 3-hourly summaries that they provide is 25 kilometers. So that's the 25-kilometer footprint in yellow there in the Blue Mountain Coffee area, in red, outlined in red. So basically we're talking about average over the entire region being one cell. And so that red dot is the central point of of the cell that covers most of the region. We have looked at data from that cell for the last 12 years, which is what's available from TRIM. The bottom right there is the actual, that's the daily rainfall from TRMM since January 1998. The TRMM data for an individual 25-kilometer grid cell is not great. Over a wider area, it's reasonable. We're obviously seeing the peaks where we should see the peaks, and that's good. But it's not a good enough record to really do either thorough statistics on or to run a index program off. To the top left, there's one of these statistical analyses for a station which is close to the centre. It's Mavis Bank, which is right in this area here. And this is the record that this is all the information we have basically from the pre-1992 rainfall. And so it's a Gumbel plot of the peak return period, so the reduced variance at the bottom, and then the return period is the bar just above the bottom there. So you've got 2, 5, 10, 50, 100 year. That's the return periods, and you've got these, and this is daily rainfall. So you've got 100 years. You've got about 500 millimeters of is the daily rain at that return period. So we're talking about extreme events with very high levels of rainfall. Going on to the wind data, as I said, there is no wind data in the Blue Mountain Coffee region. The Jamaica Met Service has a limited wind measurement network, which does not include any stations in the Blue Mountains. So this has to be a modelling approach. We don't have any other option for the wind. But fortunately, wind modelling is much more. It has a much longer history than rainfall modelling. And it's been very well tested and validated at 1 kilometre resolution, so we're more comfortable with that, with the modelling approach for wind. I've highlighted here that obviously we need to build these new weather stations, and they can start to collect data and build a baseline, so they can quite soon be useful in normalising model outputs once they're in place. But you can't start driving a program from them until you have an established baseline at that particular site, and that applies both to wind and rain. Now, one of the other challenges that we're faced with is that in index insurance you need to have two approaches to defining the hazard and the risk. One is a probabilistic approach to come up with a probabilistic risk curve which you can price a product on, but the other one is you have to actually trigger a product for a specific event. And if we look at this map here, this is a 50-year maximum loss estimate of 10-minute sustained winds over the Blue Mountain Coffee area. And it goes from about 150 miles an hour down to, in the valleys where the yellow and green areas are, to around less than 100 miles an hour. So again, there's a pretty good range within the Blue Mountains itself. But also this map does not apply to any single event, and so you can look at this map and see areas which seem to have fairly homogeneous probabilistic wind hazard, and the same goes for rain. But actually, for an individual event, those areas wouldn't necessarily have the same impact. If we imagine a storm going to the east of Jamaica, for instance, then the eastern end of the Blue Mountains is going to have radically different wind speeds and probably rainfall than the western part. So this probabilistic map is a good basis for, or is a good overview of what a pricing curve would look like for the overall product, but it can't be used as a means of establishing areas for triggering policies, because the areas for triggering policies need to have a homogeneous hazard in a single event. So these are actually risk curves coming off the probabilistic wind hazard assessment, and in different zones that we had started to define within the Blue Mountains for trying to find clusters of producing regions which we can actually get a single policy with a single pricing curve to try and cover. Obviously, with hundreds of farmers and widely distributed fields, we're not going to be able to give a different policy with a different trigger point and a different pricing curve for every farmer. So we've got to bring these into some sort of clusters, but those clusters have got to be valid not only for the probability for the pricing curve, but also for an individual event. So this is actually a first effort at doing this zonation, and those zone numbers actually correlate with the wind hazard from the previous, even though you can't actually see the numbers, these are all of these different zones, the 13 zones that we've started to define. So these zones have mainly been defined on the probabilistic hazard level, but this was an example of where we looked at an individual event to see if this zonation might hold up during an actual event. And so if we look at, say, area 8 here, down here at the bottom, which is quite a big area, takes in quite a few different farming areas within this area, one might think, well, that's a little bit too big. If we go back to the probabilistic map, this area is down in this area down here and in here. So we've got a bit of difference in the probabilistic hazard, but actually in an individual event, certainly in Ivan, the rainfall is fairly homogeneous over this area, even though it's a fairly big area. So there's an indication here, and this goes for most of these areas actually, where 13 isn't too good. There's quite a range in rainfall estimate for 13, but number 1 again, which is quite a big area, has a fairly homogeneous rainfall. And so one might think, well, okay, we're onto something at least, that all the farmers in area 1 could have the same policy, which has pretty much the same pricing conditions, and also in an actual event they would get very similar rainfalls, even though those farmers may be at different altitudes and actually in reality have quite a range of rainfalls even on their own farms. This is the kind of approach that we're now working on with the Coffee Industry Board and amongst the team to try and isolate these areas which really from a hazard and risk perspective, but also of course there's the practical implications of, well, how many of these zones can we really come up with? How many different types of policy? How many different policy formulations can we actually sell? How many times do we go through a process with a group of farmers and explain the individual aspects of their own policy? So there are some very practical and logistical issues that we're faced with, and clearly we've got to find some kind of balance between reducing the basis risk over an area and making the areas big enough that they're actually implementable as an index insurance scheme. So I've said most of this, I think, in what I've just been talking around the diagrams. We need to have clusters where the producers have similar hazard characteristics from both a probabilistic and a single event impact point of view. And those zonations don't always synchronize with one another, and that's, I think, right now is the biggest challenge that we're faced with in the Blue Mountain Coffee region. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, for this interesting presentation about the progress achieved in agricultural risk modeling in the Blue Mountain Coffee region in Jamaica. Before I open the floor for 10 minutes questions, I will ask Christoph Gentles, CEO of the Coffee Industry Board in Jamaica, to provide some comments about this presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm Christopher Gentles, the Director General of the Coffee Industry Board. It is a great honor to be here and to be once again sharing with some of the members of the World Bank team, which we've been working with over a long period of time, on the possibilities of implementing a risk transfer mechanism for coffee, which is absolutely critical for the delivery of our mission. The Coffee Industry Board is responsible for the development of the coffee industry, for the regulation of the industry, and for the protection of the stakeholders. And of course we have various stakeholders, which include the coffee farmers, more importantly, about 10,000 of them. We have the coffee dealers, which are associated with the coffee processing plants, which deliver services to the farmers and arrange for export. And of course, we have the interests of our exporters overseas. One of the critical services that we've been able to provide, certainly for the period of at least 8 years leading up to Hurricane Ivan in 2004, is crop insurance. And the farmers have looked forward to this to reduce the risk. And since 2004, Hurricane Ivan, we've had 4 significant storm events, which has truly made very clear the absolute necessity of having some risk transfer mechanism to assist in protecting the industry. Because, you know, if farmers go through event after event and continue to lose money, then the interest in sustaining the growing of Blue Mountain coffee or whatever the activity is will decline. So therefore, when the World Bank proposed an index-based insurance system, both the Ministry of Agriculture and the Coffee Industry Board said, we're definitely interested in that. Now, I can tell you that after visiting the field, after our various hurricane events, for those of us in this room who are risk takers, and if you could find a very safe place in the Blue Mountain, it's absolutely one of the most exciting places to experience a hurricane, as long as you can be assured that your shelter will be safe during the storm. Unfortunately, some of our farmers have been through experiences where they've seen the roof flying off, and the coffee trees during Hurricane Gilbert, which was a landmark hurricane. We actually saw 3 entire acreages that were rooted up. You know, so the importance of having a successful risk transfer mechanism is absolutely critical. Simon pointed out that we have some gaps in terms of our weather collection data, and I'd just like to say that he did such an effective presentation. I thought he was actually in Jamaica for a long time. But we have some gaps in terms of our wind and rain collection data, and we're using some modeling of satellite data and other means to close that gap. And it involves a lot of work and a lot of time and dedication to close those gaps. And of course, at the board, we're trying to implement a higher, if you understand that growing Jamaican coffee is a highly traditional affair, and those of us from Central America, especially the coffee growing regions, Pablo can give a test to this, that there are many very traditional farmers, and we will have the job, if the pilot is successful, of selling them the policy. And I'm going to ask, perhaps with Mr. Diego Arias and Carlos's permission, we can ask Simon to do some of the selling job, because he communicates quite well, of explaining to the farmers that this model approximates what will happen in your area, and it will not be perfect, but it will deliver a solution that's much better than the one we have in place now, which is no solution at all. So again, on behalf of the coffee industry and on behalf of Jamaica, I'd like to thank the World Bank team for the work. I'd like to thank all of you here for coming and for giving us the opportunity to share with you some of these challenges and to participate in the development of an innovative way of reducing risk to our farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Before we go to our next presentation, I think we have time for just one question, maybe. Yes, could you move the...
This one? Okay. One question. Is there really a direct correlation between loss and the rainfall? How is about other factors, parameters like slope and flash floods coming and all these probabilities. I would expect that some of the farmers are not that highly exposed to rainfall alone, but probably to other hazards. So is this also planned to be part of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was presenting was the pure trying to define the underlying hazards, the primary hazards, rain and wind. But what some of the others in the team working with Christopher and his team on the ground are looking at actual events and actual experiences and trying to see what are the driving factors. We know, for instance, as well, slope, yes, that is important. Slope management is an issue anyway for the coffee farmers. So there are traditional ways of managing that risk that they have in place. So those have to be taken into account. Things like road closures. In Ivan, there were landslides across roads, which sometimes in critical areas, which stopped, farmers getting what they could salvage, getting any value out of that. So those kind of factors as well. It's an extremely complex series of secondary and tertiary impacts. What we're trying to do, and really, I think the only approach that we can see is we've got to define the hazards, the underlying hazards as best we can, and then we've got to work through these experiences and try to integrate those into what could be an incredibly complicated model, but ultimately we've got to try and pull out something that's relatively simple and at least reacts in a reasonable way to the big events. And I think one of the things we always know about index insurance is that it's not going to work for the really small events where one farmer in one area has had a few trees knocked down, and that's part of the education process. This is really this is for the Gilberts and the Ivans and the Deans. It's not for the relatively small events where other risk management tools have to be used to try and reduce those risks, and there has to be some kind of other rainy day fund, if you like. One of the big things in selling it is that it's not the silver bullet. This is not the solution in and of itself. It's part of the solution, and we think it can be a cost-effective way of transferring some of the peak risks.
In the majority of events that we've looked at, by large and by far, wind and rain are the primary drivers of crop loss and events due to there are a relatively small proportion of landslides. They're significant, especially if you're that farmer, but when you look at the entire group, it's a relatively small proportion of them that suffer from that.
Thank you very much. Now I have to run to our next presentation, so I will ask Alex and William Dick to present about modeling floods risk for agriculture production.
Thanks. As you heard in the introduction, the concept of index insurance or weather-based index insurance has received quite a bit of attention in recent years, and even at the highest level in the context of the international climate negotiations, this concept is widely discussed and expected to deliver insurance solutions, simplified insurance solutions, in particular for the developing world. And the work that we are about to present arose from a number of requests from lending institutions in Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as countries, to see whether the concept of index insurance that has been gaining some traction for drought insurance, for drought protection, could be expanded to flood insurance as well. So we took a long and a hard look at a number of cases where we were hoping to demonstrate how index insurance for flood could be designed and operationalized in a number of countries. Now, the agricultural flood losses can can be significant, and they're difficult to estimate globally, but at the country level and at the sub-national level, they can be significant. As an example here from the Philippines, the palay losses, the rice losses, can amount to 5 to 25% over the, or have amounted to 5 to 25% over the course of the past 15 or so years. And even at the national level across different regions, as you see at the bottom, they tend to average 2 to 5% on average, just palay losses. And that is due to typhoons and floods. Again, the respective impacts of rain and wind are very difficult to disentangle, as we just heard from the presentation by Simon on Jamaica. The same applies here for rice, which was one of the key crops that we looked at. So the experience that our presentation is based on is based on a number of feasibility studies, if you want, in the Southeast Asian areas with cases from Thailand and Vietnam, and also feeding in some experiences we gained in Bangladesh and the Philippines. And again, it was the demand for insurance solutions, simple insurance solutions based on weather indices that drove us to develop some work there and test some of these ideas in practice. And the challenge obviously is for agricultural products and rice in particular, that oftentimes the hazard locations, the spatial distribution of hazards coincides spatially with the area of agricultural production, as you see in the bottom graphics there, where on the left you see recent flood events observed over the past 8 or so years by satellites. On the right you see the agricultural extent in the dark green colors, and by and large they sort of coincide. So this is a key challenge. So as far as the modeling is concerned, we have a number of challenges, and it's distinctly different from the kind of modeling you would do for property insurance, where the physical asset that you hope to protect or insure or model the risk for doesn't move. In agriculture, the asset, the value of the asset changes over time, over the course of a growing season, as you see here for the case of rice, as well as the spatial patterns of the physical asset change. Most regions in Southeast Asia, for instance, have grown 2-3 cycles of rice, and the spatial patterns of these plantings are not always the same for each cycle. So the modeling has to account, first of all, control for the normal flow of water in these regions, which is obviously an integral part of rice farming or agricultural systems, but also figure out when and where you have too much water that causes damage. Now, what we try to harness is essentially two sets of tools. One is sort of the physical models that help us model the flood hazard, as well as remote sensing technology that provide us direct observations of the inundated and flooded areas. And unlike in drought insurance or drought index insurance, where we have had some experience at the time, the technical work that has to go into the design of a flood risk model is a lot more demanding, and there's a lot more different and heterogeneous data sources required, such as shown here. So you need to have information on topography, on hydrology, long-term records of stream flow, land use, the infrastructure that controls the flow of water in a region, etc., etc. So a lot more data is required to even model the basic hazard relative to purely modeling the drought hazard. The work was also partly driven by advances in remote sensing technologies, and as many of you will probably know, that the kind of things that we can observe today with satellites from space has much improved compared to just even 5 or 10 years ago, and there's a suite of satellites operating these days that can give us relatively fine resolution pictures of flood extent and flood duration. So the idea was to harness this technology and to see how it could operationalize into a service to support an insurance system. And we essentially use this kind of information in two kinds of fashions. One is to validate and calibrate the model output that came out of hydrodynamic models to see whether the extent that these models that they predict, as shown here at the bottom left, actually corresponds to the extent that satellites can observe in the field, as shown in the example on the right here. That's an example from Thailand. The other role for remote sensing, and that's again similar to the work in Jamaica, would be to give us a more refined picture of what the actual impacts occurred and use that information as a basis for designing policies, or more broadly as a basis for targeted compensation to affected farmers and farming communities. And again, as most of you know, this technology is not only more readily available, but it's also increasingly cheap and affordable, and even available and used for other applications in the countries that we work with. So again, some promising conditions that we found in the country. Now, to give you the main conclusion of all this work, sort of up front, and we'll refine this conclusion later on, or William will do this at the end of the presentation, is we found it's very difficult to not only design a flood index for the purpose of insurance, but also it's also very difficult to operationalize that for a number of reasons. And we find it very challenging or very difficult, and perhaps in many parts of the world, even impossible to design flood index insurance at the level of farmers or farming communities. So an alternative solution that we have pursued somewhat, but not in great detail, is to use satellite remote sensing directly rather than using models to provide direct observations of flood extent, and over time build a record of observations that allow us to estimate the return periods associated with flooding in certain areas. And what is shown here is an example that is derived from more coarser remote sensing data that provides at the regional scale a relatively good picture, detailed picture on flood extent. The blue areas that you see here were mapped from the MODIS satellite, which provides observations at 500 meters, which would be too coarse to monitor individual farms, but at the regional scale provides a relatively detailed picture. And the different shades of blue show you different flood events and the extent, and the red one is one specific current event from last year. So we see this as an alternative means of using remote sensing with frequent observations that don't provide the detail at the local level, but provide the frequent observations to help governments and subnational entities to provide compensation and support in a post-disaster situation. Now, this was the basic modeling approach that we chose. So combining flood modeling and satellite observations to model the hazard and assess the risk at the local level in a number of sites. William will now take over and discuss how we're hoping to turn this information into an operational flood index insurance system and the challenges that we encountered.
Good. Thank you, Alex. I'd like to approach this more from an insurance point of view, looking at the technical and the operational perspectives as to what was involved. The motivation behind this is essentially that, as with drought insurance, where in the low-income countries, small farmer operation of traditional crop insurance is exceptionally difficult or impossible. So the perspective was, could these index principles that have been developed with some success for drought index insurance be applied to flood risk? And one issue coming out of this is actually to consider whether flood insurance, how it relates to flood compensation. And there are, generally speaking, some considerable advantages in having an insurance system as opposed to a compensation system, if this is possible. And of course, one of the key points here is that there is a contractual relationship in flood insurance, which means that everybody knows where they stand, and it is agreed in advance what the payout arrangements will be, and that there will be legally contractually viable arrangement, and furthermore, that the risk transfer can be effected to the reinsurance market provided that it's technically viable. So this is quite a different situation from flood compensation, which tends to be ex post and often ad hoc, and is very difficult for governments to budget for, and we will talk a little bit more about the outcomes of this study in relation to these two options. So if we just consider the kind of traditional approach to modeling a risk and coming up with some estimate of frequency, severity, and we define the hazard, which, as Alex has commented, with flood modeling is significantly difficult at a micro level, not least because of the different types of flood, with the difference between flash flood, which is often very important, compared to riverine flood on large-scale floodplains. So we have different types of flood to deal with. The vulnerability aspect is very critical because duration of flooding and the timing of flooding is extremely important in relation to the crop growth cycle. And of course, most farmers are growing a production system that is already adapted to the flood regime, and the timing is often related to the capture of fertility from flood events. And so this is an additional kind of complication. Exposure is the one thing that you can deal with very effectively in technology, because GIS mapping of farm locations is very a routine type of event to be working with. So the design of the actual index and the pricing of that index, as we'll see, is really highly challenging in relation to an insurance scheme. Now, ideally, what we'd have liked to have been able to achieve is something like this, a kind of prototype, micro level, that's to say farmer level type of payout structure. As I said, on the right-hand part of this, the duration of flooding is really important, so a kind of traditional index approach. Well, I say traditional, it's a relatively new approach, but the idea of having a payout scale that relates, for example, to the timing of inundation that the plant has suffered, for example, is quite a good approach. And also we were keen to see what hard triggers, that's to say measurement of rainfall or measurement of a river gauge data, could perhaps trigger an initial payout, opening the policy, if you like, to say, which is something the farmers understand much more than a model. So this is something we'd have liked to achieve, but we decided at the end of the study it would be extremely difficult to design this product at a level of even a village level because of some factors like localization of flood. So the organizational concept here, which we still think has quite a lot of validity, is that the question of grouping farmers based on homogeneous flood risk zoning is very critical to having all farmers in a specific area who will receive the same type of payout. And this is more feasible on certain types of floodplain where the hydrology can be modeled and is a question then of the resolution level that you're going to need to have to capture these homogeneous zones. So you could have areas that could have specific payouts based on all the farmers in a particular zone, and there might be a pricing that is based on a much wider zone than that in order to have a pragmatic balance between local risk and more general risk. Also, we could use some experience we've had with index insurance on how to organize an insurance scheme for distribution to farmers, what sort of technical support might be needed by an insurer, and what sort of parties are needed to provide that sort of technical support, and capacity building, which is on the bottom left chart here. Now, because our conclusion was that the micro level index insurance for flood is an extremely challenging kind of target, we have concluded that there is a more definite role, an opportunity here to have what we'd call a meso-level insurance program, which is where we find an aggregator of risk. That's to say, it might be a local government area, might be a cooperative, it might be a bank, it might be even at the level of a mutual insurance type of society or association at a local level, who could handle some of the actual distribution of an indemnity made and triggered at a level of the overall flood risk, flood event in a particular area. This has several implications that it could be used to transfer the big risk, if you like, in terms of flood risk to the insurance market and the reinsurance market. And this, the critical point here is whether you can actually set transparent and workable payout rules with the aggregator that is going to genuinely be accepted by the farmers, not subject to elite capture or manipulation by aggregators at that level. And this also has a lot of opportunities with, for example, agricultural banks who have a portfolio of risk that may be exposed to flood. So this is where we see we're moving towards how you could introduce this into more of a disaster compensation system where you are going to take out the big risk. So just 2 slides to finish up with some sort of findings of this feasibility study. Clearly the first point of the delineating of flood risk is challenging. It's complicated, and you do need to have comprehensive and complex modeling to achieve it, especially at a micro level. And this is partly because of the different types of flood risk and the fact of the changing agricultural asset, that's a crop growing in a season and being vulnerable at different growth stages to different levels of damage. And if one thinks even of livestock, of course, you have a problem that livestock are moving quite often if they are herding livestock, but may be subject to flood exposure. Remote sensing is definitely the sort of key technology that can be applied to help both in the calibration of the flood models, but also during some sort of loss assessment impact. It does require some technical capacity, but in some respects it could be more manageable technical capacity than extremely detailed flood modeling. So our feeling is that remote sensing has an extremely important role to play. A finding which relates also to any existing insurance schemes that do cover flood is that voluntary insurance schemes for flood are not really viable because there is always going to be adverse selection against the insurer. That's to say, only the high-risk farmers insuring, however good you can get at trying to zone the risks according to high, medium or low or whatever. Also, riverine flood as opposed to flash flood riverine flood and inundation zones may be more feasible to insure, but still you often, in certain types of flood zone, have either very high risk or no risk of flood, which comes back to the point about needing some form of automated or compulsory flood insurance. Operationally, difficult to operate because of the localization, and also because the valuation of the loss is time sensitive. So to set up the measures that will have a time sensitive payout is very important in the design. The operation of remote sensing, even for loss adjustment, to delineate the zones requires that you are well organized in order to be able to identify on a time-sensitive basis, for example, day by day, the areas that are flooded. And as Alex said, the amount of heavy lifting in terms of technical capacity, often absent in developing countries, both for flood modeling or remote sensing, or indeed in the insurance industry, is another issue with regard to sustainable capacity building of local institutions. Also, this has to be said that, of course, flood risk management per se, which is a critical part of agricultural production in any areas that are remotely flood sensitive or flood prone, is critical, and human intervention is another factor with flood training and with detention areas where areas may be preferentially flooded in agricultural areas in order to protect urban areas. So there's a lot of human intervention in this. And remote sensing is a powerful technology, as we've mentioned, both in terms of insurance, but also to support disaster compensation systems where you can use this to help to identify spatially the areas that have been damaged if there is to be a system of verification of damage in order to target compensation payments in a less formalized system than insurance. Finally, reinsurers are pretty interested in the technical applications here to create some transparency in a flood insurance system. That risk transfer, if you could deal with the front end of this, the risk transfer is of interest to reinsurers. And finally, this publication is available online at either this particular rather complicated link at the bottom here, or can be found on the website of our own team, which is actually, I have to look this up, it's www.worldbank.org/AGRM, which stands for Agricultural Risk Management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex and William, for this excellent presentation. I'm sure that our participants have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we are running a little bit out of time. So I have to ask you to keep these questions in mind until the end of the session and allow Edgar Uribe to present very briefly his PowerPoint presentation. And we will have time at the end of the session to answer the questions that we may have. So, Edgar. Edgar, we present, we'll talk about using weather data grids for completing spatial and historical data series.
I'm going to talk about graded analysis of meteorological variables for Guatemala and Honduras. This is part of a project called Support to the Development of the Agricultural Insurance Market in Central America. And as been mentioned here, one of the most important challenges is the lack of information. And this is usually associated to the limited coverage of stations in our regions, missing data in the historical records, short historical records due to new or recently installed meteorological stations, and also missing data when we apply quality control. So one of the solutions I proposed while I was working in AgroAcemex was the use of regular grids, and these subproducts of the regular grids have been in the portfolio starting in 2008 in that company. And these regular grids are generated with the Cressman methodology. It's a methodology that I propose in the company, and it works with two sources of information. The first one is, and the most important, is meteorological observations. And the second one is the North American Regional Analysis, which is a product of a atmospheric model. So once we have the gridded analysis, the benefits are complete historical records for the whole domain and for the whole period of interest. In our case, we are working for this region for 30 years of daily records. So it is around 11,000 fields of daily information. And another benefit is that I am able to integrate every record available in the region. And finally, one more benefit is the easy association of maps with other spatial features like assets, political boundaries, topography, etc. So the analysis is breakdown in two components. The first one is the feasibility analysis, when based on the meteorological database, we define whether it is feasible to develop a gridded data set. And the second component, in the second component, we apply the methodology and evaluate the results. And like I said, this has been applied for both Guatemala and Honduras. So I'm going to start by the first stage. So we start by taking the original databases from the local weather services and checking for coherence and consistency in the database, which means we make sure that there is a consistent missing data flag for the whole database, and the dates are consecutive, and there are valid dates in the records, because sometimes we have like February 31st or something like that, and many issues in the databases. So we have to make sure the data is ready for the gridded analysis. And just to give an example, in the case of Honduras, we eliminated around 16,000 records, and they were usually associated to spurious dates, like I said, like years 2020, for example, stuff like that. But it's in the original database, so we had to remove them to clean the database. And even though we eliminated all this information, in the end we had a relatively low porosity. We only have 25% porosity for precipitation, 20% for maximum temperature, and only 5% for minimum temperature. After that, we check for climatic inconsistencies, which are usually associated with the calibration of the instruments, and we remove all these suspicious data from the data sets. We also check for outliers and for illogical values. Believe it or not, databases have negative precipitations and maximum temperature over minimum temperatures, so we also check for that. In the case of Guatemala, we decided to remove around 40% of the meteorological stations. Fortunately, these stations had very short periods of records, so it didn't actually impact the percentage of available records in the region. In the case of Honduras, only one meteorological station was eliminated because it was falling outside in Nicaragua, I think. We also fixed 155 records of maximum temperature and around 1,000 of precipitation. These are the location of the meteorological stations, and the labels, probably they are very small, but they are the percentage of valid records in the region. For Guatemala, we have pretty much the same coverage for all the variables, but in the case of Honduras, we have a very different coverage for precipitation and for temperatures. So from here, we decided to have a gridded analysis with different resolution for those two variables. These are the characteristics of the gridded data sets. For Guatemala, we are proposing a gridded data set with a pixel size of 16 kilometers. For Honduras, a pixel size of 9 for precipitation, and for the rest of the variables, a pixel size of around 26 kilometers. Like I said, it starts in 1979 and it ends in 2008, daily information. So it's a lot of information. And these are actually the gridded data sets, just to give you an idea of the location of the pixels. So the methodology is called Cressman, and it is a successive correction of a preliminary field, in this case the North American regional analysis. The North American regional analysis is developed by NOAA, and is the result of atmospheric model. It's a very high resolution long-term database. It has 8 reports for every day. For evapotranspiration, we are working with the Hargreaves method, basically because the information is available for this methodology. And this is actually a sub-product of the gridded dataset because it is based on the temperature gridded datasets that we are developing here. And for solar radiation, I'm taking the information from the North American regional analysis itself. One interesting feature is that it takes into account the impact on solar radiation from the atmosphere, including clouds. For the evaluation, I'm taking some skill scores used in atmospheric sciences. Some of them should be familiar, like the root mean square error and the correlation coefficient. And some of them just tell you how good we are at modeling dry and rainy days. This is an example of a Cressman analysis. I'm afraid the labels are not very clear, but this is the initial field from the atmospheric model, and these are the readings at the meteorological stations, the black labels, and this is the result after I apply the Cressman analysis. It is a random day, like I said, it's a lot of information, so I had to select something. And in the end, you will see that the results after Cressman, now the gridded analysis is reflecting the true observations, very close to the observations in the meteorological stations. This is another example for Honduras. And once again, after Cressman is applied, now the grid analysis has been able to capture very strong events. I think around here I had an event of 129 millimeters, and it's been captured by the gridded analysis. And also, as part of the evaluation, I usually like to develop climatologies because they give you an idea if the patterns make sense. And this is a climatology from the annual precipitation and from an independent source, in this case the Ministry of Agriculture of Guatemala. And the patterns and the values, the range of values are very similar for both. This is another climatology, the daily average temperature for Honduras. In this case, we were not able to find any regional climatology, so we worked with the Climate Research Unit. Unfortunately, the resolution is not really good for comparison. This one makes much more sense because it is capturing the effect of the topography, but the range of values is very similar as well. This is another climatology, evapotranspiration, and this is solar radiation. Like I said, I'm working with NR data, and this shows that it has an interannual variability, unlike other methods, and it also shows the impact of clouds during the rainy season. So for the evaluation, like I said, we use all the skill scores. They are really good. Most errors are below the unit. I mean, 1 millimeter for precipitation and 1 Celsius degrees for temperatures. And we also compared with precipitation from similar results in Europe and analysis in Europe and in Mexico. And in both cases, the skill scores in Guatemala and Honduras were better. So I'm running, I don't have more time, so I'm gonna finish. These are just like examples because sometimes the evaluation is not, people want to see like the hard numbers, and these are examples of events. This is a hurricane, and what I'm showing here is the values that are being captured by the grid analysis. Very strong events like over 400 millimeters. And this is a frost event, also capturing temperatures below -4 Celsius degrees. And this is a drought event, El Nino, in 1997. And I'm showing again that I'm being able to capture long periods without rainfall. So, like I said, I'm going to have to finish. And So I already mentioned the first three items, and one of the most important arguments, or one of the most common arguments against the use of graded analysis is that there is smoothing on the data, and that is true. But we also have to understand that I'm not trying for risk analysis. We don't need to actually reproduce the exact values of the events, but I'm more concerned about capturing the probabilities of the catastrophic events. So in this sense, we are, based on the evaluation and similar experiences in Mexico, we are recommending the use of these gridded data sets for the development of risk management schemes in Guatemala and Honduras. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edgar, for this presentation, and thank you to all our panelists for the presentation. I will immediately open the door for questions. Yes.
Yes, a question to Uribe. Have you thought of using, complementing, if I understand correctly, you're using only rainfall stations for the gridding. Have you thought about using rainfall estimates to complement the information? Is this something that makes sense? Is possible, not possible?
Yeah, actually, what Gredman does is the implementation of two predictors. The first one is the meteorological stations, and the second one is the results from the numerical model, the atmospheric model. So that will be the second predictor.
Yes, first of all, I would like to congratulate for the job that you have done. But I have two questions. You mentioned, and I agree with you, that flood is subject to many man-made factors and political factors in the middle. And this, in my view, will have two consequences. One on the pricing and another on the basis risk that you have after the event. How did you manage that? I mean, I am asking this because I am coming from Argentina. In Argentina, in 1998, a big flood there. Farmers, of course, they start to build up canals, drop the water to the neighbor. The mess was at county level and at the provincial level. I mean, even with bullets in the middle. I mean, fighting across the border because one put a defense and the water can. How did you manage this kind of situations? I mean, in the pricing and after that, what do you think that it should be done?
Yes, I mean, I think, and this isn't a unique thing, of course, for flood insurance. In many classes of insurance, and you never have perfect data in insurance. And many types of insurance are actually covering risks that have major political, human intervention, all sorts of things in them. So, but I do agree that where there is a situation where there is actually a almost pre-planned management of water resource management, that's clearly not an insurable event because there is, for example, flood detention areas that are going to be flooded. There may be a human intervention in relation to, shall we say, a corrupt intervention, as I think you've suggested, that there may be, what I would say is kind of human intervention that is not predicted. Okay. And these cannot be easily insured or modeled, of course. So it's actually a decision for the insurer to decide whether or not this type of additional risk to the natural risk is something that's acceptable within the context of providing an insurance cover. I mean, clearly we were trying to move as far as possible to the transparency of a modeled and understood type of risk. And there are many other interventions, including the human one, that alter the actual situation in a particular event.
Thank you. Two more questions, please. Yes.
I think this question is for Alex and William. With regard to, you had mentioned adverse selection with regard to the risk for flood insurance, because the farmers who are more susceptible will insure, and the farmers who are less susceptible won't insure. Of course, we have that same problem in the Blue Mountains, but through legislation, you insist that it's either everyone insures or there's no insurance, and depending on the geographical region, you tend to find somebody makes a decision, and it involves politics and legislation that look, for everyone's safety, then we'll all insure. The question is, what proportion of your cost of production will be insurance, and is it viable in the current production model, which is a very important issue. And I have one more question, is what is porosity?
It's the percentage of missing data in the time series.
If you can answer the question.
I think it's more your.
I will try and answer it. I mean, the conclusion of existing flood insurance schemes is that, for example, if you're going to have flood insurance in property insurance, you pretty much are going to have probably flood insurance included in many countries, unless it's specifically excluded. That allows you to capture a large pool of insured people because they already have insurance of another property insurance, classic property insurance. In the case of agricultural risks, multiple peril crop insurance, where it exists, heavily subsidized in some countries. It does include normally flood insurance, and again, you're kind of getting a pool of risks where flood is included. If you have flood as a standalone insurance policy, you're talking a different situation, because for sure you're not going to be able to capture the pricing of the risk at every location or every level. So you are absolutely open to adverse selection. And in some schemes, for example, for agricultural flood, like in Spain, which they added in after they had introduced the main types of crop and livestock insurance cover, it is actually automatically included at a certain price, because they have worked out for the whole portfolio of farmers what the overall price should be for covering the flood risk. So there is cross-subsidization, essentially, of the high-risk farmers in that scheme.
And just to add to this, and perhaps answer Ramiro's question as well, the work we presented were based on feasibility studies, and it was mostly sort of the technical work that we undertook. We didn't even get to those politically challenging situations, and we didn't actually implement any of the schemes that were designed. It was mostly sort of a feasibility study. But those were the kind of problems that we precisely anticipated working at this local level. So one of the key conclusions from this work is if countries or institutions or even the bank want to pursue programs like this, it's a more reasonable and more feasible starting point is probably sort of at a macro level. And not try to drill down to farmers or farming communities where you run into all these technical and political economy questions, but work at the macro level, capture the big events, the broad impact, and use some of the technology that we explored to support a compensation or relief program. And not an insurance program per se, sort of as a starting point. You can use that as a building block for further refinement further down the road, but don't start with the most difficult problem right up front.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 short questions. Yes?
Perhaps a bit of a naive question, but I just wanted to know the exact reasons why traditional indemnity-based insurance would not be applicable in these cases, and whether there has been any serious feasibility study in terms of introducing indemnity-based schemes, given the high basis risk obviously involved in this type of schemes.
Yes, that's the point here is that traditional indemnity-based insurance, which requires field loss assessment and measurement of the loss immediately after it's happened, may be feasible and is used indeed in many of the high-income countries where there is flood insurance. It's almost all is done by measuring the loss after it's happened. But that may be feasible where you have large-scale farms. In the case of agriculture, it becomes cost-effective to do that. We were primarily targeting the low and middle income country situation where you always have large numbers of small farmers, you don't have trained loss adjusters, and you don't have the pool of people to be able to manage it, and it's uncontrollable at a catastrophe level when a major event occurs. So it actually isn't an option where you have a small farmer community and lack of capacity to think about a traditional scheme like that.
I think we have more questions, yes.
Just a quick one. I am wondering, in moving to index-based flood insurance, what is specific index, what are the candidates for specific indexes? It's going to be the water height per day, number of days with certain height?
Yes, and it would pretty much be determined by the kind of risks that exist at the local level. So there's also some interaction that is necessary with the farmers to understand what the risks are, whether it's sort of an early onset of the rainy season that causes damages shortly after planting, or whether it's the typhoon season starting early and cutting into the tail end of a cropping cycle. It's different kinds of risks, and it would have to be determined through a stakeholder process what the risks are and what the important risks are to protect. But ultimately it would be variables such as water depth relative to the crop stage, crop inundation duration is a key parameter. A short inundation period of a day or so may not do any harm, but if it's inundated for 3, 4, 5 days, you have incremental losses. So it is in fact variables like those that would be critical, but at the same time those are also variables extremely difficult to model. Those were sort of the technical challenges that we ran into in this work.
Last question, please. Yes. Yes, please.
Well, this is sort of a question and a comment. I was just wondering, this is with respect to the lack of data that we were discussing in the beginning, that has methods of indifference pricing been applied in this field? I mean, we at Germany, especially in the University of Berlin and Göttingen, there's been a couple of teams who have really done good work with indifference pricing, but as far as developing countries are concerned, you probably have better resources to do that. Has it been applied? Because if there's a lack of data, then you don't have good probabilities, you can't run burn analysis, and therefore it affects your pricing, I guess. So that was it.
Do you want to?
I just wanted to say that in Mexico, for example, in AgroAcemex, we have been using the product like the one I just showed, and they have been applied in catastrophic insurance products back in Mexico. So it's kind of experiences that we have with these sort of products, and they have been applied for frost and floods and droughts as well.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, William, I just wanted to find out, and Alex, you had suggested in order to manage complexity, you move from the micro level to the meso level. But when you do that, would you still have individual farmer contracts, insurance contracts, or would you, through an intermediary like the cooperative or the banks that you had suggested, would they do the allocation? or would you have a predetermined contract? That's the question, basically.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Essentially, you can use an aggregator like a bank as an intermediary to sell a policy that still the contract is still with the individual farmer. Now that is still really a micro level scheme because the contract of insurance and the payout is to a specific farmer. Mm-hmm. Now actually a meso level scheme is saying that the aggregator or the bank or whoever is going to have to set the rules and be responsible for that. So ultimately, the individual farmer is not holding a contract of insurance in his hand.
Oh, I see.
It's like a grouping where there is a collective arrangement and agreement between those farmers and the organization in order to have a payout structure that is set up between them. And it does kind of acknowledge that there is a basis risk where there may be localized differences between farmers of the amount of damage they've actually sustained. So it's a more controversial area, and I know why you've asked the question as well. But so we can talk further about that, perhaps.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists for these presentations. I personally learned a lot about risk modeling in the implementation design of weather index-based insurance. And I want to thank you all of you for your participation in this session. Thank you.